All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights and our campaign for equal dignity programming. Today, we will have a really interesting program that is a partner to our program from last week. The name of it is Modeling Allyship. And the first thing I'd like to do is just take a moment to thank the thousands upon thousands of poll workers doing a very diligent job to fulfill our civic responsibility of a fair and free election. I think it's a really vital and brave thing that they're doing. So I really appreciate that. I hope everyone's doing well in the pandemic, and I hope that soon we will see an end to a lot of the problems that we're having in the country right now. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our host. Her name is Vonnetta West. She's the lead teacher and pastor at Our Neighbor's House. Dr. Vonnetta West is the pastor of Our Neighbor's House, a community passionate about growing, giving, and going, inclusive of building and educational centers in Liberia, West Africa, where Dr. West lived for 2 years. She is the senior nonviolence instructor at the King Center and the founder and CEO of Go West Consulting LLC, which facilitates experiences and produces content to connect, transform, and engage people for good. Go West Consulting provides training on eradicating racism, the bias challenge, leadership that grows, salvation versus community, the language of the beloved community, and other sessions aimed at building and sustaining community, including in professional spaces. Welcome, Vonnetta West.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So if you would like to introduce our panelists, I will help you out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here today. It's an excellent time, I believe, to be talking about modeling allyship. And we have a great panel today for this discussion. We have Mr. Dov Wilker, who's the Regional Director of the American Jewish Committee. He's been the Regional Director of AJC Atlanta since 2011 and previously served as AJC Atlanta's Assistant Director. In that position, he was selected to participate in the first United States professional exchange in South Asia, visiting Sri Lanka in the summer of 2009. He's active in the community. I can see that. Dove sits on the board of the Faith Alliance of Metro Atlanta, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition's Georgia Advisory Committee. I'll go on and stop and tell you right now, I think the people on this panel are, we must take our vitamins. And the Council for the Atlanta Ballet and the Legacy Committee at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. After earning his international BA from Tel Aviv University, Dove worked for an Israeli software startup. He began his career with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Southeastern United States and has been recognized as a 40 under 40 by both the Atlanta Business Chronicle and the Atlanta Jewish Times. He was also honored with the Asian American Heritage Foundation's Distinguished Community Service Award, and he received his BBA from the University of Miami. He's married to Julie Jacobson, and they have 2 daughters. Welcome, Dove. Thank you so much for joining us today. And then we also have on our panel today, Tom Glenn, who's the trustee of the Wilbur and Hilda Glenn Family Foundation. He's from Atlanta. It's rare that you actually meet somebody from the ATL. Most of us are transplants. He received an AB degree in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MBA and PhD from Georgia State University. He devotes most of his time to philanthropic interests and serves as a trustee of the Wilbur and Hilda Glenn Family Foundation. He is an alumnus and former trustee of the Westminster Schools in Atlanta, where he founded Westminster's Glenn Institute for Philanthropy and Service Learning. Other philanthropic interests include civil and human rights, healthcare, and education. He has served as chairman of the Board of Governors of the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University, chairman of the board of Young Harris College, and chairman of the board of the United Methodist Children's Home. He has also served as trustee of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, the Georgia chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and the Island Institute in Rockland, Maine. Tom was recognized with the 2018 Diversity and Inclusion Award from the Atlanta Business Chronicle for his work to create and promote the Atlanta Interfaith Manifesto. Welcome, Tom. Thank you so much for being a part of our panel today.
Thank you.
Thank you for still going strong and having so much energy and working to build the beloved community as well. Thank you. Erin Beacham joins us today on our panel. She's the Deputy Regional Director at the Anti-Defamation League Southeast Region. Prior to this role, she was the Education Director in the region for 5 years. ADL Southeast Region encompasses Atlanta, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee. Alabama, rather. Hey, Alabama. I'm from Alabama. Roll Tide. The office was first established in Atlanta in 1946 and has served those communities in the South ever since. In this position, Erin develops, manages, and implements ADL's programs. These programs include a World of Difference Institute, the premier anti-bias trainings for students, counselors, teachers, No Place for Hate, the year-long bullying prevention campaign, workplace diversity trainings, as well as Holocaust education. Erin focuses on coalition building and partnerships throughout the region. Welcome, Erin. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so the next portion of our program is about experiencing a piece of art together, which we will then create a conversation on allyship in relationship to. So today, our piece is going to be performed by Miss Jamie Allylaw. I'm going to give her a second to introduce herself. And she'll be performing a speech that was given by Frederick Douglass in 1841. So Jamie, if you would like to introduce yourself and begin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Allylaw. It is an honor to be here as a participant on this panel for this, I think, very vital conversation today. I am a transplant to Atlanta, originally from California, but I've been in Atlanta for 10 years. I am an opera singer and just performing artist. And so it is an honor to lend my voice to Frederick Douglass's words. So this is his speech, The Church and Prejudice. At the South, I was a member of the Methodist Church. When I came north, I thought on one Sunday I would attend communion at one of the churches of my denomination in the town I was staying. The white people gathered round the altar, the Blacks clustered by the door. After the good minister had served out the bread and wine to one portion of those near him, he said, "These may withdraw, and others come forward." Thus, he proceeded till all the white members had been served. Then he took a long breath and looked out towards the door, exclaimed, "Come up, colored friends, come up, for you know God is no respecter of persons." I haven't been there to see the sacraments taken since. At New Bedford, where I live, there was a great revival of religion not long ago. Many were converted and received, as they said, into the kingdom of heaven. But it seems the kingdom of heaven is like a net. At least, so it was according to the practice of these pious Christians. And when the net was drawn ashore, they had to set down and cull out the fish. Well, It happened now that some of the fish had rather black scales. So these were sorted out and packed by themselves. But among those who experienced religion at this time was a colored girl. She was baptized in the same water as the rest. So she thought she might sit at the Lord's table and partake of the same sacrament elements with the others. The deacon handed round the cup, and when he came to the black girl, he could not pass her, for there was the minister looking right at him. And as he was a kind of abolitionist, the deacon was rather afraid of giving him offense. So he handed the girl the cup, and she tasted. Now it so happened that next to her sat a young lady who had been converted at the same time, baptized in the same water, and put her trust in the same blessed Savior. Yet when the cup containing the precious blood which had been shed for all came to her, she rose in disdain and walked out of the church. Such was the religion she had experienced. Another young lady fell into a trance. When she awoke, she declared she had been to heaven. Her friends were all anxious to know what and whom she had seen there. So she told the whole story. But there was one good old lady whose curiosity went beyond that of all the others, and she inquired of the girl that had the vision if she saw any black folks in heaven. After some hesitation, the reply was, "Oh, I didn't go into the kitchen." Thus you see, my hearers, this prejudice goes even into the Church of God. And there are those who carry it so far that it is disagreeable to them even to think of going to heaven if colored people are going there too. And whence comes it? The grand cause is slavery, but there are others less prominent. One of them is the way in which children in this part of the country are instructed in regard to Blacks. Yes, exclaimed an old gentleman, interrupting. When they behave wrong, they are told, "Black man can catch you." Yet people in general will say that they like colored men as well as any other, but in their proper place. They assign us that place. They don't let us do it for ourselves, nor will they allow us a voice in the decision. They will not allow that we have a head to think and a heart to feel and a soul to aspire. They treat us not as men, but as dogs. They cry, "Stew boy," and expect us to run and do their bidding. That's the way we are liked. You degrade us and then ask why we are degraded. You shut our mouths and then ask why we do not speak. You close our colleges and seminaries against us and then ask why we don't know more.
Thank you, Jamie. I should probably mention that there was a slight bit of editing we did there for space and time, but that was almost exactly what he said. There was a little bit in the middle there that came out. I'm going to turn the conversation over to Vonnetta to discuss thoughts on that piece and modeling allyship.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jamie. That was beautiful. Thank you. Who articulates the condition and the hardships and the connection between the church in this case and oppression more profoundly than Frederick Douglass? I think it's very telling in this piece, his understanding of how we can be complicit in the oppression of other people groups. So let's just start there with a discussion around this piece. Erin, Dove, Tom, what are your thoughts about Douglass's words and how they connect to allyship, particularly for us as members of this group, Interfaith Response to White Supremacy? It's a part of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights Equal Dignity campaign, and we're honored to be a part of that group. But when you hear Douglas's words, how does it resonate with you for this conversation today? I'll start with Dove.
I had to get myself unmuted. First, I have to say how much I appreciate the ability to participate in today's program, and how much I value the center's role in bringing us all together. You know, when I think about Douglas's words, it shakes me how relevant it is still today. You know, when we, you know, for centuries we have been struggling to both battle oppression and find allies. And I, you know, as a member of the Jewish community, have, you know, seen the way that, you know, our engagement with non-Jewish communities has, you know, enabled us to be supported in times of crisis. But not just in times of crisis. I believe in, you know, in our everyday lives. And so to think that, you know, it's still, it hurts me to think that this is still a conversation that we have today, but it also creates hope that there are, you know, there have always been people at odds, and which means that there's always been opportunity to be able to create allyship and to bring people together.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Dove.
Yeah, to echo Dove, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And then I also totally agree with Dove that that it, you know, over 100 years ago that this was written, and it's still so relevant today. And it still shows that that work has been done, but that we have so much work to do. And that the lessons that we learn in our places of worship, from our families, from our friends, how young, you know, it talks about the children, and that these are the messages that children are receiving. And so even the work that we do in our schools with our young children, how important that is. The narratives that our young children are hearing today, and how we need to change those narratives, so that we don't have a young child that says, oh, I didn't go into the kitchen. And so just really understanding how important those words are, those messages are, wherever they're receiving them. But to Dove's point, just how, even with everything that has happened this week, just how powerful this is, and knowing that it is still so important today, in the conversations and building allyship today.
Thank you. Tom, your
Sure.
thoughts?
In getting ready for this webinar today, I was thinking about the terms white privilege, white supremacy, and systemic racism. But when I was putting my notes together, I put down by mistake systematic racism. I thought, wait a minute, I've got that wrong. So I did a little Googling and came across an interesting description comparing systemic with systematic. And I'm not going to go into this other than to point out, particularly reflecting on Douglas's comments, the extent to which racism is systemic. It's woven into our fabric. It has been for over 400 years. And it's one thing to say, this is wrong, let's not do this anymore. But let's think about, I pull a little garter snake out of a brown paper bag, and I tell you, it's not poisonous, it can't hurt you. As a matter of fact, it's good not to kill these things. But so think of the fear of snakes. I think that systemic racism is as deep, long-standing, as thoroughly woven into our society as a fear of snakes for a lot of people. And I think I'll stop there, but that's how I connect Douglas's comments with some thoughts I had.
I don't think we wanted you to stop. We were listening intently. Thank you so much.
Some people
Yeah.
here may have a fear of snakes, and so I don't want them to turn off
Yeah,
Wait, can I respond to that?
sure.
It's such a powerful analogy, though, Tom. I mean, I've never thought of it that way. You know, there are innate fears that we have as people. I mean, sharks are another one, right? So maybe you change it, but there even, you know, and I've, you know, been talking about this concept of systemic racism, of allyship for quite some time. But I've never actually thought about what other analogies there might be, because it seems so institutionalized. But you're right. I mean, even the Indiana Jones in the,
Yeah.
I think it was the Raiders of the Lost Ark. In the Raiders of the Lost Ark, he ends up in a thing and there's snakes, and he says, "I hate snakes." But he finds a way to persevere through it, even though he hates snakes, because he knows that is how he has to. That's the only way he's going to survive. And so, you know, based on your analogy, which really is tremendous, you know, it shows that we are able to overcome, and that there are, you know, actually many more occasions where we can overcome than we will be overburdened by the racism. It's almost like it could be, you can flip it into a message of hope based on the way that you use that analogy. Or at least that's how I like to be an optimist. So I'll switch it that way.
No, I think it is hopeful, especially when we define allyship. I think we have a lot of words that we use today that we don't often take the time to define it. But the way we're discussing this today, I think it's important to look up what allyship is. And this is one of the definitions. Allyship is the practice of emphasizing social justice, inclusion, and human rights by members of an in-group. Now that phrase was intriguing to me. I underlined it. I said, oh, the in-group must be the people who are at the table or on the table, similar language, to advance the interests of an oppressed or marginalized out-group. This is an actual definition online. Allyship is part of the anti-oppression or anti-racist conversation, which puts into use social justice theories and ideals. Let's talk about that, because it's, you know, when you have a title of a session we have today, modeling allyship, and some of the things we just mentioned, you know, systemic racism, the history of racism, Douglas speaking then as though it is now, we're still facing these same issues. How do we define allyship? And how do we, in particular, I thought about this when I saw that definition, how does the definition need to shift so that it means that if there's an in-group, that in-group tries not to be the in-group anymore? You know what I mean? How do we shift from equity, from equality to equity to justice? What is the role of an ally? So a lot of questions rolled into one, but let's start with Erin. What is allyship? When you think about that word, how would you define it? That's important for us today, I think.
Yeah, just as you said, there's so many things that are rolled into allyship. I think for me, there must be some sort of action. It's not just saying, oh, I'm an ally. There's got to be some sort of action that is involved. And I think it's also about listening. It is going to those marginalized and those targeted groups, or as Dr. West, you said, the out group, and asking them, what do you need? It's not about us going and saying, this is what you need. It is really building those coalitions and listening to what targeted people need, so that we can understand or hear how we get to that piece of that part of equity and that part of justice. And so I think there's so many other parts, but I think the action part and the listening part are, for me, two of the most important sort of aspects of being an ally. And I think I've had a lot of conversations, which is really interesting, is it's really up to those targeted groups to decide whether or not we are allies. It's not for me to say I'm an ally to the Black community, or I'm allied to, whatever other marginalized group it may be. It's really up to that group to determine whether or not I have been an ally. It's not necessarily for me to say. And I've had a lot of conversations about that. And I think it really sort of lets people reflect on those actions that we have done, and whether we've done enough to support and to help marginalized and targeted groups.
Tom, your thoughts? What is allyship? Thank you, Erin.
Okay, moi?
Yes, sir.
I think it's terribly easy when you're trying to be an ally to be condescending. And I think it's important to keep in mind the issue of who is helping whom. I mean, there's clearly a problem on both sides. If you are either the perpetrator or the victim, if you're the perpetrator in this particular context, the fact that you cannot get out from under 400 years of culture and you're struggling to do that, you need the help of that person to whom you're trying to be an ally to get over your problem. So I think if we put ourselves in a position that we're going to reach down and help somebody with their problem, we just mess everything up there. We got to keep in the right perspective who the ally is. I guess I've said enough about that from what I think.
You said something very important there, Tom, because I often think of allyship, and it occurs to me that sometimes when we talk about it, it sounds as though one group has to come help another group, when often, and when Dr. King describes what's happening with white people, he talks about how white people need help too. That in this allyship, if we don't eradicate racism and what he called the triple evils, then we're leading to our own annihilation. So in a sense, we're allies to each other for a common purpose. What happens, though, what do you think happens if we shift that perspective a little and start to talk about allyship in that way?
Well, if we start talking about it that way, then we realize just how difficult it is for both parties.
Yeah.
And that this ain't going to be easy. It's not an easy walk, and it's something that's fraught with mistakes. You mean well, you want to say the right thing, but you discover that you messed up. You can't let that get in your way. You got to keep going, working toward and understanding the ally. The person trying to be the ally needs to understand her weaknesses and ineptitude in this. I came across a statement here. This is from the Oregon Coalition Against the Domestic and Sexual Violence. They've got a pretty good definition of allyship. But this statement caught my eye. The experts on any form of oppression are the people most directly affected by it. And their analysis of that oppression always takes precedence over the opinions of people who don't experience it.
Absolutely. Share your thoughts, though.
I love that. I love that last part. We see it. We see it all the time in the Jewish community. People telling us what's anti-Semitism. That's my favorite thing, is when someone says, "Well, that's something." They love to say, "Oh, this is anti-Semitism," and I say, "But it's not." Or I say, "It is anti-Semitism." They say, "No, it's not." We actually just released a new report called the State of Anti-Semitism, and one of the statistics was that 65% of the general U.S. population, non-Jewish general population, said that it would not change their opinion if a Jewish person or Jewish organization called something anti-Semitic, right? 65%, so 2/3 of America, of the general population polled, to them it doesn't matter. So if I say it's anti-Semitism, they're not going to necessarily accept that. So I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. I mean, it's really something that I don't think we often think enough about, right? It's the self-identifier. I tend to disagree a little bit with Erin that I think that you can be an ally without the recognition of the group from whom you are trying to be an ally. It's just a personal view, because I believe it too easily can then dissuade people from trying to be allies, because they might not be accepted as one, and then they say, oh, well, if I'm not going to be accepted as an ally, I'm not going to invest in trying to support them. I think it's more of a minority, but I still worry about that. I mean, if we even just look at the voting, you look at the voting data of our state, right? We're 50-50, right? So 50% of the people vote one way, 50% of the people vote the other way. So there's clearly differences of opinion, and we have to, I believe that we have to find ways of bridging the gaps that are there, not from the extremes, but really, the centrist divisions that might be there. I want to read something, because you asked everybody else about the definition of allyship. So a young lady named Sophia Bork, who's a Catholic Latina who's involved with our Jewish Young Professionals group, shared a story about helping to combat anti-Semitism. And she wrote on Facebook the following. She goes, "The word allyship is being thrown around a lot these days. Allyship is courageous. It's making conscious choices to stand up for others who may not be there to defend themselves, and having hard conversations with people that can leave you feeling isolated and disconnected afterwards. At the end of the day, it's being compassionate and patient, yet strong in the midst of those conversations." I mean, I couldn't have said it any better. And I think that the piece of that really speaks to me is that it's about being present to be an ally when the group that you want to be an ally to is not able to be present. And we see that all the time, right? We live in a society where we are mostly, for the most part, you hang out with people and spend time with people who are probably more like you than not, and you have to be willing to defend and support and educate peers or just random people for the groups that are experiencing oppression. And I don't, those are also the stories that you really don't hear that often. Like, those are the stories that you want to see more of, that we actually we really haven't created an avenue to be able to share those, because you do it out of because it's the right thing to do. You don't do it out of self-promotion. And I believe that the more I'm not saying the center should do this, but like, imagine if the center had a way for people to submit their stories of allyship in the face, or submit stories of allyship when the allies aren't present, right? Like, that would be powerful stories to hear and to see and to experience as an outsider.
It sounds as though too that you can be invited or not. Like, you can be an ally if someone's invited you to do that. You think about the movement and the things that happened for rights in the 50s and 60s. A lot of instances, people were invited in to participate, and they became allies. And you have Viola Luisa. I don't know if anybody invited her. She saw a flyer and she came in, I believe, and decided to participate. But certainly historically, is considered one of the great allies of the civil rights movement. So it could be by invitation. It could too be, I'm your ally and you don't even know it, because I'm working in ways that you just might not be aware of. And that's good, because a lot of the pushback today too is when people come in as allies, a lot of the credit goes to them, particularly when they're not a part of what's called, in this definition I read, the out group, or the group that's being oppressed. So there's a lot to balance there, but we can do it. How much do you think communication plays a part in being an ally? Just understanding what's happening in a situation and being able to articulate injustice. Do you think that's a lost art, the ability to articulate and frame an issue in the area of allyship? Any one of you can jump in, whoever wants to take that. Should allies be able to articulate the issue in a clear way?
I'll add on, only because I think I was quicker to unmute than Erin and Tom. Yeah, I think that there's a communication is clearly a lost art. Debate is a lost art. Civil discourse is a lost art. We live on Twitter and Facebook, and so I juxtaposed two emails I received before the election. One was from a church, and one was from a synagogue. And the church, the message was very simple. It was very clean. It was like, must have been 50 words on the entire email, but it was all about civility and steps that you could take. And then the message from the synagogue was probably 500 words, and it was 10 paragraphs. And I looked at it and I said, oh, I'll wait to read that later. And I say that sort of as a bad example of how I defaulted to the simpler message that I viewed, but should have defaulted to reading the long form, because we have lost the ability to sort of articulate in that way.
Mm. Erin or Tom? Here.
I think the words certainly matter, but the attitude underneath the words is particularly important. Specifically, if the person trying to be the ally comes into the conversation assuming that he is not guilty of white supremacy, systemic racism. Other people do that. I don't. I'm on your side, so I want to help you. Then you come across as a fraud. So you got to be willing to understand, if you're trying to be a good ally, that you are guilty with all the rest, so that whatever you say thereafter doesn't get discredited because you're perceived as being insincere or unrealistic.
Thank you.
And I think, as Dove said, it's messy, and there are things that we will agree on. There will things that we will not agree on. And I think, to Tom's point, there may be times that even as allies, we make mistakes. And I think I think a lot of people talk about that oops and ouch, where, we may lead with something that we think is the right thing to say or the right thing to do, and it's not necessarily the right thing to say or do. And so being able to Dove's point, to have those sort of just civil conversations with each other that we aren't having anymore, whether over a cup of coffee or virtual or whatever it may be. But when somebody says, sort of hold you accountable for what you've said, that you can hear them and even just say, you know what, I'm going to do better next time. And I think that's part of that allyship, are those conversations, but being able to hold each other accountable, and learning from the mistakes that we possibly make as allies.
Let me share a comment from the chat room. Thank you, Tom, Dove, Erin. This is making me think about Frederick Douglass saying, they will not allow that we have a head to think and a heart to feel and a soul to aspire. This is a quote from the piece that Jamie shared in the beginning. The comment goes on to share, our role as an ally is to ask, how might we elevate your thinking to be heard by the masses? And by that, I think the writer means, how can we get your thinking more out there and share it with more people? How might we comfort your hurting heart? How might we accompany you on your aspiration journey? 3 questions there, 3 great questions, I believe. Thank you, Robin, in the chat room. How might we elevate, get your thinking more out there, your thoughts, because as Tom shared, it's very important to convey and to be sure it's conveyed the thoughts, the beliefs, the journey of the group that has suffered the injustice. How might we comfort your hurting heart? How might we accompany you on your aspiration journey? And another key question, I think, too, is allies. What part of that is leadership and what part of that is fellowship, if that makes sense? Because there'll be instances where you may need to lead. I think it's very important for people who are allies authentically to know when to lead in some areas and when to say that's absolutely not my area to lead in, and to know when to be invited to lead as well. But these questions, in addition to these questions, how do I know when to lead? And how do I know when to just engage and to be support? But the chat room asks, how might we elevate your thinking to be heard by the masses? How might we comfort your hurting heart? How might we accompany you on your aspiration journey? How can I share as an ally your thoughts? How can I be a comfort? How can I show compassion? And how can I accompany you? How can I be with you on this journey? What do you think about those questions? Do you have any thoughts or any answers to those questions? They were a lot, weren't they?
I'm glad I see a therapist.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
Look, they're in the chat, and there's
They
a
are.
lot, and I'm glad I can look back in the chat to make sure that I actually answer at least part of it. Look, I do believe that our ability to share other people's experiences in our own communities is significant. I don't think that should be discounted. I think that is a major role for us to play. I know, like in the Jewish community is very diverse. There are Black Jews, there are Latino Jews, there are Asian Jews, there are Indian Jews, there are Jews of Eastern European descent, there are Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent. I mean, we run the gamut, but yet we still have to educate we have to educate our own community about the challenges that other communities face, even though Jews are within each of these communities. So only looking at it from I sort of always view it through that lens of how do we elevate the awareness of issues in our own communities, because it's an easy place to start. If you want a harder way to start, I believe is, how do we use the media perhaps to elevate these conversations? And what type of voices do you need to be able to amplify or what are the stories that need to be told that perhaps might not be being told? And it's not about the TV and the newspaper anymore. I mean, I think it's about the podcasts, it's about blogs, it's about mediums. I think it's a little bit of everything. I hope I answered part of it.
And I think this goes back to how Tom started the conversation, looking at white supremacy, looking at white privilege and privilege in general, right? Not just white privilege, but privilege, so many of the other parts of privilege that exist in our country. And I think that's also part of it, is doing that sort of research on what are the oppressive parts of our society, of our systems, whether it's voting rights or housing discrimination or the inequalities or inequities that are happening in our schools, like all of those parts. And I think part of it is just going and understanding all of those parts of our systems that are oppressive, and doing that sort of individual research and having, again, that goes back to the conversation piece. It goes back to reading and listening and all of those parts where you can really learn about the systems of oppression that are happening, what is built on white supremacy, and then again, like, what can we do as individuals to make those changes?
Thank you.
At the personal one-on-one level, where comfort is concerned, bringing comfort to the oppressed, I think it's important to first take that person seriously and listen a lot more and talk a lot less. Hear them out, and when they get near the end, say, tell me more. Because there will be more there, but let them be in the driver's seat in terms of the discussion. At the group level, Dove referred to stories. I think in a lot of contexts, stories get more across than data or any kind of raw information. And I think there are so many good stories to be told. And now that social media is what it is, I think we need to get out there, make more effort at bringing these stories to light and sharing them so that a greater portion of the population realizes how ubiquitous, how deep, the depth and breadth of systemic racism. But I think we need to bring these stories out.
Stories are phenomenal. I think for me, even when I visit the National Holocaust Museum, it's the stories, the accounts. I remember as an 11th grader in my public speaking class, my public speaking teacher assigned Night by Elie Wiesel. Changed my life because as a Black girl growing up in Tuskegee, Alabama, surrounded by teachings on the suffering of Black people and the history of people who had come from, been brought here as enslaved people from Africa, to read that book. And that story made me say, here's a community I need to be an ally to. And also it reminded me or taught me the universality of suffering, that all over the world still people are being oppressed, and that white supremacy has been oppressive in many nations and in for many people, indigenous people, Black people, Jewish people. It has been a force that has harmed people all over the globe, sometimes or oftentimes in the name of faith. So what do we do with that? How do we, in our faith, what part does faith play in us being allies? Particularly for you, if you want to share stories, or just for you personally, what part does your faith play in you being an ally against injustice and for justice?
Can I, before I answer that question, I want to jump on something that you said that I thought was very powerful. You know, the way that educators choose, you know, how educators choose to, what stories they choose, what books they choose to, I think that's a huge opportunity and continues to be. I'm to say my daughters are in 2nd grade and in pre-K, so I'm not totally at the advanced portion of the type of reading that they would otherwise be, but knowing that there are books and stories that even they could be using in school, I think that is really a tremendous way for us to be encouraging the ability to share stories. Does anybody want to answer the faith question before I do? Oh, you're gonna, oh, fine, okay. So
They're like, no, go ahead.
Tom is going to have a much better answer than I am, by the way. I mean, it is guaranteed he's going to have a better answer. Look, I think that what we ask of our faith leaders is, I'm not sure that we necessarily ask enough of our faith leaders. I think all too often rabbis, priests, pastors, imams, they, you know, probably for better or for worse, they don't want to get involved in a number of issues because they don't want to perhaps be divisive. They don't want to challenge the status quo. They believe in teaching their faith, and that is why they were called to lead in those positions. But I think we can push on them a little more to say, how does our religious teachings inform us today? How has it evolved? And again, I mean, we as a Jewish community, I mean, we're so small, but ensuring that we are using our faith-based opportunities to share more stories of other communities, I think is really powerful. We have a Muslim Jewish Advisory Council. It's a national initiative, and it's really what's been most incredible is that it's a diverse group of leaders who, not all of them are rabbis and imams, but it's people who believe and practice their faith in whatever way they choose to practice, have come together to support each other because we believe that we believe that we have to be able to come together. So. Anyone, I don't know.
Erin or Tom?
Vonnetta, I'm reluctant to speak to this given your background. I mean, it seems like you're the one who should be providing the answer to your question. I think you and Dove and Erin know far more about this than I do, but I've been told by people that know a lot about it, that all of the Abrahamic faiths rest on the notion of the golden rule. And though we tend to extract pieces of our dogma here and there to utilize how we'd like to at on various occasions, that's the bedrock. And it seems illogical that you can embrace any form of systemic racism if you have any religious faith at all, or even if you don't. But I think we should sit at your feet here, Vonnetta, addressing this point.
I told you his answer would be better than mine.
You know, for me, that's, and I share this with his daughter often, my key connection to Dr. King is I think his life is an example of how to translate faith into action and how to take a belief. Some people want to negate that he was a Christian minister, how to take a belief and transfer that into work for justice. So sometimes people will say, oh, Dr. King wouldn't be political. And I'm like, Dr. King, he was marching for legislative change. He was marching for justice. You know, he was marching for a change in laws. He believed in heart change, but he also believed in legislative change. So a key thing for me is to believe that we should have both. We should change laws, we have to, but we also, particularly as faith leaders, have to concern ourselves with both legislative change, justice, and also heart change. Otherwise, we just are on a cycle and keep coming back. So allyship for me is very much connected to my faith. It gets me in trouble sometimes, because sometimes you can be talking about one injustice and you start to mention one that doesn't sit too well with people and they don't want to work on it. For instance, I can be talking to people about, you know, let's help end police brutality. And then I can say this, let's help end police brutality against Black transgender women. And the room can go cold. Things can stop because there's this space where, you know, you're going a little too far with that because we wanted justice for this group. We weren't talking about justice for this other group. But in my faith practice, we want justice for everybody. So that allyship is absolutely, for me, connected to my faith. It's very intertwined, but I also believe you can have no faith practice and want justice and kindness and fairness. Erin.
Dr. West, I don't know if I want to go after you. Mrs. Tom and Dove said that it would be awesome. I mean, I think, you know, my only other thing would be like, also invite people to come to your synagogue, to come to your church, to come and, you know, so many of us, we stereotype and we make assumptions about people of other faiths when we are all so different and we're coming from so many different backgrounds. And so even if it's virtual, come and invite somebody to one of your services and then have a conversation about it. And I think I would just add that to the conversation.
I totally agree with Erin. And I think, Dr. West, one of the things that you said that was so powerful was about the change that we can see. You know, so last week, 2 weeks ago, the Catholic Church celebrated the 55th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. And Nostra Aetate was a defining document by the Vatican Council II, which said, it talked about the church's relationship to non-Catholic faiths. And two tenets that were within it were that it condemned anti-Semitism, and it said that the Jews were not responsible for the killing of Jesus. Those are two fundamental changes from the Catholic Church. And it took place 55 years ago. And I share that as an example of how advocacy and allyship really do come together. Like, we don't have to assume that just because a faith-based institution believes something today, that it can't change its thinking by understanding, by having allies. And I think it's, so if the Catholic Church is able to change such a significant piece of its thinking, then any institution, frankly, should be able to change it, will have an evolution of its thinking. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us to remember as we consider faith being a faith-based ally.
That, for me, though, raises this question. When you mentioned that about the statement from the Catholic group saying that Jews were not responsible for the killing of Jesus, how important is it for an ally not to contribute to pain? Because I don't think we often think about that there are things that I may believe, but I'm not going to go around stating them because I don't want to contribute to pain. And then I also realize perhaps I shouldn't believe that anymore. Let me go see if I need to adjust my beliefs, because ultimately I believe in these two great commandments that Christ gave: love God and love your neighbor. And how does that translate into what I speak and even into my allyship? What do you think the responsibility is to not contribute to pain and suffering?
I mean, I think that you should never intentionally contribute to pain, but I believe that if you do, that you should be willing to to acknowledge that you have contributed to that pain. So I think, because that's where, if you're, so you shared an example that you are aware of something, so you don't want to, you might not say it because you know that it will contribute to pain. But you should, on the other hand, I would say it's important to, and this is a little controversial, right? Like, you should feel comfortable enough with the people that you are engaging with to share your beliefs, so that you perhaps can understand why it might be painful for them, or for them to be able to understand why you might believe that is something that you believe. I think I said that correctly.
Folks, I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware that we have about 3 minutes left, so it might be time to kind of wrap up with final thoughts.
Yes, thank you, David.
No.
Someone shared here, and I think it's important to convey in the Q&A, their concern for comparing suffering. I call that atrocity Olympics. This was worse than that. This was, and that's not what allies do. We realize that each group, there are groups that have suffering, and then individuals have personal suffering that might not be relative to groups that they're a part of. But as we close our conversation today, thank you so much to each of you. As final thoughts, as we talk about modeling allyship, what is just one thing that you believe an allyship model? Let's give people just one thing from each of us that we believe as an ally, we should model this. What's a characteristic of an ally that you believe is just a must-have? Tom, you're the only one unmuted, so I think you're going first. They did that to you on purpose.
I'm the very worst at turning on the mute and off. Now, I don't think I can give you a good answer to that, but in a closing point, and what relevant to the last, is that in using words, whatever, and this is a very pragmatic issue, there is white supremacy, there is systemic racism, white privilege. Beware of the term white supremacy when you are toiling in this vineyard. You can come across, have unintended consequences. And if you're trying to change attitudes or solicit support, that phrase, white supremacy, in the wrong context can arouse very negative response, defensiveness, rather than getting you to where you want to be. I've learned that. So that's my little point that I would contribute.
Dr. West, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. And I'm saying the most profound things too, and nobody could, yeah. But I was saying that Tom, I think his answers a question in the Q&A, the last question in the Q&A. How do we get to validity and truth? And I think, Tom, it's very important that we have honesty about our phrases, about our history. I think that's a key part of allyship, honesty and truth. And we have to have conversations, courageous conversations to get there. Erin, how would you answer that question? What's a key characteristic of an ally?
I mean, I think, I don't know if I could say just one, but I think you said it is having courage, having the courage to be an ally, knowing that you may lose, people may unfriend you, right? We may lose friends or family or have really hard conversations, but I think that courage is definitely one. And I think being vulnerable, and I think that gets back to that sharing your own personal stories, making mistakes. So I would say courage and being vulnerable, but there's so many others, but I think those are my two for right now.
Thank you.
I would go with empathy. I think I think it's amazing to see how they teach children empathy in school these days. And I wish that it was sort of taught on a much broader scale, because I think that will have a tremendous influence in the continuing evolution of allyship.
Thank you. Listen, we're all learning, we're all growing, and we encourage you to be in spaces where we can learn and grow together. As someone pointed out in this conversation today, we'll make mistakes. I think Dove and Tom pointed that out, Erin to some extent as well. We're not going to get this all right, but if we can continue to learn and grow together and say, this is our ultimate goal, this is what we want to create, I think we can get to where we need to be. That's why we're hosting these discussions. That's why we believe in equal dignity. And that's why we as faith leaders are committed to responding to white supremacy. So thank you for joining today. Thank you for tuning in. Share the link with friends, share the Facebook Live, and let's continue these conversations and couple them with action. Let's be great allies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Vonnetta, and thank you all for joining us. I just wanted to very briefly let everyone know that we have more programming coming up as a part of our campaign for equal dignity. Disclosure is a recently released film. We're having a discussion on November 20th. It's available. The film itself is available on Netflix. Also, on the 13th, What Does Election Mean is another campaign for equal dignity panel discussion. So please tune in for that. Obviously, it's going to be a topic we're all pretty engaged in next week. So thank you very much for your time. Oh, and a last thank you to Jamie Allylaw, our wonderful performer. I may have selected that a Frederick Douglass piece, but she is the one who gave it a fantastic voice. So thank you to Jamie. And everyone, have a wonderful day. Get your rest. And we will see you next week. Bye.